Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to come see my presentation. I just wanted to take a moment out to thank the Spiceworks community. You guys have given me so much over the years, and I just wanted to give something back with this presentation today. How to become the ideal IT person for any IT-related job. My name is David Arango. I am a systems administrator at Semaphore. What is Semaphore? Semaphore is a patient-centered health intelligence company dedicated to providing the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of disease. But in order to do something like that, you need one heck of an IT department to back you up. Let me tell you a little bit about myself before we get started. I'm passionate about technology. I started my career off very green. I was a customer service guy and ink refiller at a break-fix company. I quickly moved from software to advanced hardware repairs to finally opening and managing stores. In 2013, I moved on to the managed service provider world, where my knowledge and experience grew exponentially. I finally joined the corporate enterprise world in 2017. I'm a tinkerer by nature. Making technology do things they were never intended to do is kind of a thrill for me. And lastly, where did I learn my patience? I get this question from time to time, and it comes from helping out senior citizens in a fixed income retirement community learn to check email and browse the web. So, what does this talk about? Today we're going to talk about changing the relationship between you and your employer for a better life and a successful career. Some things have been said before. Don't think of it as a repeat. Think of it as reinforcement. We really need to reinforce these ideas. Many topics were unfortunately removed to time constraints. And this talk is less technical and a lot more practical. And if you came here for the PowerPoint, you will be sorely disappointed. So let's talk about the unfortunate truth. The unfortunate truth is that not every job you have will work out. Move on with pride, keep your head held high, and don't be discouraged. First, let's talk about self-improvement. There's always room to grow. Never stop developing your skill set. Find a book that interests you, perhaps a hobby that you've never tried before, as long as you're doing something that continues to grow your brain. Secondly, I want you to dump your ego. A lot of us, when we get a lot of experience, we stop asking for help. We stop talking to our colleagues. And that's the wrong thing to do. It's the wrong mindset. Because when you do this, you close the doors to knowledge, perspective, and opportunity. So let go of your ego. You don't know it all. Lastly, on this slide, don't be a hero all the time. A lot of us want to be the IT Superman. We want to get to our SLAs faster, and we want to please our customers. But this is wrong. This sets a higher expectation with your employer and your client, and it's going to wear you out very quickly. To make sure you delegate that work properly. So, a long time ago, someone once told me, Dave, there's only two types of workers in this world. There's your bare minimum employee, who comes in from 9 to 5 and does only what the bare minimum requirements are. And then there's your above and beyond expectations employee. This person comes in early, they leave late, and they go beyond the scope of their employment to provide excellent service. By show of hands, how many of you know someone or are the bare minimum worker yourself? All right. How many of you are or know somebody who is the above and beyond expectations employee? Oh, look at that. Well, the truth is, it's not a binary choice. You need to find your balance. The answer is somewhere in between, something that works best for you. Next, I want to talk about being proud of your work. A lot of us go through our days and we just do things just to get them done, but we're not really proud. And what I mean by this is maybe you're a sysadmin. Make sure your cabling's neat. You don't just plug it into a computer and leave the wires all mangled. Nobody likes to see that. Double check your project before you deploy it. Make sure it's all working. Maybe you're in DevOps. Make sure you write your code to standard. Put useful comments in that code. And is your code easily read by others? Maybe you're a security engineer. Make sure you check your rules and sweeps on affected user inboxes. Replace or reformat infected machines. Are all your company's applications regulated? Maybe you're a project manager. Do you have realistic deadlines? Have you allotted enough time per section of your project? And do you have a plan B ready in case your project goes south? Next, I'd like to talk about getting rusty. And this can happen. I want to give you an example from a former employer of mine. And we would get a project from a client, and we would go into a meeting. And in that meeting, the question would be asked, who thinks they can take this project from start to finish? And most of us would raise our hands. But the truth is, most of the people that raised their hands never got the job. Instead, we gave it to the least confident person, and we backed them up. And that kept everyone on our team sharp. So don't get rusty. And maybe you don't have this opportunity at home. I strongly encourage you to build a home test environment. It doesn't have to be expensive, it just has to work. Keep in touch with new technology. I find it very important to stay in the know with technology. And while you shouldn't buy into every piece of software or gadget that comes out, you should do your research. Some things might be a gimmick, or you might find something really incredible. Take, for example, virtual reality headsets. What was once a piece of cardboard or plastic and a phone has evolved into so much more today. New technology could be an answer to the problem you're trying to solve. There's great power in the phrase, "I don't know." It goes back to what I said about your ego. When you pretend that you know it all, or just say, "Yes, I do, I know all this stuff," you're going to get stuck with a project that you don't have enough knowledge to complete. This lets your colleagues know your limitations on subjects. It's actually a good thing. Now your colleagues know where you have some room for improvement. If you're working with a client, you might say something like, "Let me do some research and get back to you." Next, I want you to work at your own pace. Sometimes we get inundated with tasks and projects, and we feel the need to speed up our own work to make up for that. I think this is wrong. Instead, you should prioritize, delegate, and escalate your work. Never allow others to rush your work. You're more likely to make mistakes and miss the fine details. And when you make these mistakes, you're going to have to go back and fix it, and it could cost you even more time than if you had just done it at your own pace. And of course, avoid duct tape and Band-Aid fixes like the plague. While a temporary solution can be okay, it's important to get a permanent, stable solution in place to whatever you're working on. And utilize help to the fullest. We all know Google. Ask your colleagues for help. Utilize Spiceworks to the fullest. Spiceworks is the best place to get specific help on your IT problem, but make sure that you give useful information. Make sure your model numbers are in there, the firmware versions, your network setup, all the relevant information that we need to help you solve your problem. And lastly, your job is much more than you think it is. Your work affects others. Getting a solution up and running can make or save the company a lot of money. In healthcare, this couldn't be more true. Getting a department's issue or outage resolved can actually save lives. And this couldn't be more true in the case of Semaphore. When our scientists have a problem with a computer, we know it's really important to get them up and running because they're working on research that a patient is waiting on that will save their life. I want to briefly cover interviews. There have been plenty of talks about interviews before, but I just want to give you some red flags and things to watch out for when you're out there. So when I go to interview, I like to pay attention to the people I'm not interviewing with. Do they appear less than pleased? Are they not smiling? Are their heads down? Are they buried in their work? Does the office appear generally disorganized or messy? Does it not look like they put much thought into office presentation? This might be a big red flag to watch out for. Secondly, you should do a gut check. While I think it's really important to check employer review websites, I would never define whether or not you would work there based on these reviews. And I'll give you some examples of this. Let's say you have a company with a lot of raving good reviews and a couple of bad ones here and there. It's time to put on your detective hat and look into it. Were all these reviews oddly written on the same day, same week, the same month even? Do they all have the same punctuation, grammar? Do they all basically say the same thing with slightly different wording? That might be a red flag to watch out for. But you won't know more until you get to the interview. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have a company with a lot of bad reviews. Take the time to look into it. Do some research. Maybe the company had some layoffs. Maybe there's a bad actor in a certain department, and a lot of employees felt like writing bad reviews. When I first engaged with Semaphore, they had a 2.3 out of 5 on a major review website. But I took the job anyway, and it's been by far the best job I've had in my career. The next thing I want you to watch out for when you're interviewing, I call this the skill sack. And this is when you're interviewing and your interviewer starts to dismiss and belittle your skill set. This usually happens towards the middle or the end of your interview. And they're doing this because A, they want you, and B, they want you at a very low price. So they're trying to make you feel like you're not worth it. But keep your confidence strong. If they're wrong, question them back. How can you determine my skill set is this low based on the little amount of time we have met? Or what makes you think my experience in firewalls is average? Most of the time, your interviewer is not going to have anything to retort with because they weren't expecting you to stand up for yourself. They wanted you to take a lowball offer. And lastly, if you lied heavily on your resume, they're going to have plenty of reasons. So watch out for that one. And a final word on interviews. You're not just picking a job. You're choosing a manager. You're choosing your team. Make sure you can work with them. Some tips for entering a new work environment. Less is more when it comes to speaking. While you may be very good at what you do and you have a lot of suggestions, unfortunately, you just don't know everything about your new employer's environment. So take the time to write these down. Suggestions can come later, and ask your colleagues. Punctuality says a lot about you, especially in the first 90 days. In the first 90 days, I try to never be late. In fact, I'm usually in early, at least an hour early. Secondly, I find it really important to wear a watch. Time management is a lot easier when you're wearing a watch than going into your pocket and picking out your phone. And it allows you to subconsciously look at your watch and see how much time you're spending on a certain task or project. So I want to talk about leadership. What is a leader? A leader enables their team to move forward. And I want to give you an example of this. My first few weeks at Semaphore, I was walking in early, and one of my colleagues in another department had noted that the internet was down. So, like any good sysadmin, I went right to the IDF closet, and I plugged my laptop into a switch and got to work. While I was diagnosing the issue, I heard an unexpected knock at the door. And I opened the door, I let the man in, and I introduced myself. And he said, "Hi, I'm the president of the company. I'm just here to reboot the firewall." And I said, "Okay. I was just getting to that. I'm just doing some diagnostics to see where the problem lies." So finally, we get to reboot the firewall. And as one of my tests, I like to keep a constant ping out to the internet before and after the reboot, just to see how it reacts. So when the internet didn't come back, it did come back actually, but it came back for about 3 seconds. So he turns to me and asks me, "What's going on?" So I told him, "Our internal network is working just fine, but we don't have internet access." And I showed him the ping logs, and he was technical enough to understand what was going on. So he turned to me and said, "What can I do to help?" So I told him what I needed. I need everybody who's responsible for this network either on a phone call or in the office. And I need the rest of our IT team to triage as we restore that connectivity. He left and he got me what I needed shortly thereafter, and the issue was resolved. Now, there's a lot we can learn from this example. We had an executive member that was not afraid to get his hands dirty, to do something below his pay grade. And I'm sure he would have done it even if I wasn't in that room. Secondly, at no point during this interaction was there any sense of panic. If you panic in a DR scenario, you will lose. And you will lose right away. The second you allow your emotions to take over, you've lost control. So don't panic. Even if the person you're talking to is executive level, you should never panic. We're all human and we're all the same. And sometimes leaders are busy. They'll point you to somebody who can better help you. Now let's talk about the opposite end of the spectrum. Let's talk about bosses. A boss forces you to move forward. They tell you what to do and how to do it. They micromanage. They nearly never stop to help. They'll often deflect your inquiries for help. Well, what do you think you should do? They'll often blow you off. They'll say something like, I don't have time for this. This is above my pay grade, or that's outside the scope of my responsibilities. So when you see good leadership, make sure you acknowledge it, because we need more leaders in this community. We don't need any more bosses. And you might be saying, I'm not an executive. I'm not a director. How can I show leadership myself? Well, show your colleagues your worth. Back them up when they ask for help. Sometimes our colleagues don't know how to ask for help, but it's important to reach out to them. Hey, your plate's looking a little full. Is there anything I can take from you that'll make your day a little bit easier? And I've never heard anyone say no. Secondly, if there's a problem that nobody is addressing on your team, the person to resolve that problem is most likely going to be you. Take the initiative and get it resolved. And lastly, and I say this with a grain of salt, you may have to make major decisions without any approval. Trust your gut and use logic. And I'll give you a brief example of this. I was working for a small company that had a small data center. And one night, the AC system had failed. And that room was heating up, and I was getting alerts that the temperatures were above what they should be. So I sent a bunch of emails. I called, I texted, I sent voicemails. And I did it again later on. And finally, after not getting any responses, I had to make a decision on my own. And I did. I shut down that entire data center that night. Needless to say, when I got to the office the next day, I was very nervous. I had just shut down some operations for about 8 to 9 hours. I got called into the CEO's office, and he had nothing but praise for me. He said, thank you. Because if you had waited for prior approval, we would be in a lot worse of a situation than if you had just done what your instincts told you to do. Let's talk about moving on. Moving on from a job can be hard. Learn to move on when your career becomes stagnant. But before you leave, try to leave a positive mark. Try to leave something that will be remembered for years to come. You should move on if you can't move up any higher. There are no opportunities for growth. You're unhappy, and you're not being challenged. And lastly, I want to give you a quote that my grandmother gave me when I had trouble at a job and I didn't know what to do. And she said, an employee that is underpaid will work. An employee that is mistreated does not. So if you're not being respected at your job, it's time to move on. I want to talk about burnout. What is burnout? Burnout is the exhaustion of physical or emotional strength or motivation, usually as the result of prolonged stress or frustration. What is a good timeline for burnout? That varies from person to person. It depends on how you handle issues. For me, it's about 6 to 8 months without taking any kind of vacation before I start to burn out. And I want to talk about some of the causes of this. What can cause burnout? Well, obviously, prolonged periods of working without taking a realistic break. Too much workload over a short period of time. And lastly, and most notoriously, working through your vacation and sick time. How many of you, by show of hands, work through your vacation or sick time? Oh, wow. Okay. We're going to fix that today. So here's some of the symptoms I found that come with burnout. Inability to perform regular day-to-day tasks, inability to perform regular day-to-day tasks in a timely manner, lacking attention to detail in your work, tardiness, loss of sleep, oversleeping, making simple and often repeated mistakes, and forgetfulness. So what do we do about this condition that we're in? Let's talk about resolving burnout. You have to take breaks during your day. Sometimes we have to eat through our lunches, and it is what it is. But you should honestly just take your lunch. It's been said before, and I'm saying it again. At least go for a walk and clear your head. Come back with a clear state of mind. This isn't going to stop burnout completely, but it's certainly going to prolong your ability to effectively work. Try to stay away from working during this time. Even if somebody has a simple inquiry for you, you can often let them know that you need your space, and they'll understand. So, taking your free time seriously. A lot of you raised your hands there, and we're going to go over this. If you're not on call, you're not scheduled to work, avoid being glued to your work email. Life is simply too short. Go out and enjoy yourself. I want to talk about paid time off and vacation. I put the definition up here because a lot of you don't get it. So, a vacation means the time allotted by an employer for an employee not to be present at work. At no time in this definition does it say anything about answering your emails, working remotely, answering phone calls. You may have heard the expression, put the fork down. I'd like to invite you to put your phone down when you're not working. It's not a true vacation if you cannot let go of work for a short period of time. After all, they're paying you to stay away. So, how do we keep ourselves separated from work? We all know that if it's an emergency, they're going to call you. They're not going to send an email hoping that you'll respond. They're going to call you right away. Also, having a work phone and a personal phone can be very handy. And you can even set up forwarding for your work phone if you really need to. There are free cell services for those of us on a budget. But if you're a one phone kind of person, Do Not Disturb works just as well. If you're a one-man band, consider hiring a consultant to assist while you're away. Do not hire an IT service provider to protect you while you're on vacation, because that's going to be a very long vacation you're going to take. Also, change your phone's tone notification before you return. I can't tell you how annoying it is when I hear the default Apple tone all the time and I instinctively check my phone. Just change it out, cycle it out. I guarantee you're going to feel a lot different the next time a work email comes in. And most importantly, make sure you're delegating your work before you leave. Reassign your tasks to your colleagues. Include useful notes. And sometimes, while it's not always necessary, it may be a good idea to let your colleagues know why you're taking sick time. As an example of this, earlier this year, I had to have some surgery done, and I was going to be out for about a week. So I let my colleagues know, and I know I didn't have to, but this set an expectation that I was completely unavailable. And for the first time in my entire career, my space was respected. I didn't get a single phone call or an email, and they allowed me to heal. Lastly, stop worrying so much about your colleagues while you're out. I think of this as a sink or swim scenario. You go on vacation, and your colleagues were able to manage without you. That's fantastic. That's great, because now you can go on vacation more worry-free. But what happens if they can't? What if they fail? I look at this as a win-win scenario, because now you have an opportunity to grow your team. I want to go over communication. Communication is critical to your success and your employers. If you're writing an email, working on a project, or disaster recovery or maintenance, make sure you include the 6 W's. The who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how. Make sure you communicate these 6 W's, especially in a disaster recovery scenario. Update them at specific intervals, like every 30 minutes. This will keep your users informed. Even if your update has no new information to provide, it's still a good idea because it shows you're on top of the problem. And there's multiple ways to reach out to somebody, so make sure you cover your own ass. Send an email, call, leave a voicemail, text, and do it again later if you still haven't gotten an answer. Lastly on this slide, let your colleagues know before you're running late, or you may be late. This seems a little bit obvious, but a lot of us just don't do it. But if you send this notification after you're late, you almost don't have to send that email because your colleagues already know you didn't show up on time. But it's still good practice to send email. And speaking of emails, how you write your emails can define whether or not your audience will even read it. Sending a large block of text like this is a sure way to ensure your users will never read your email. Throwing in IT jargon will only make room for questions and confuse your users. Especially if you're working in a DR scenario, you don't have time for questions. And just remember that apart from 10 years ago, everybody's reading email on their phone now, so make sure you format it as such. Here's that same example, a little bit more spaced out and easily readable. Spaced formatting is a lot easier on the eyes, and you just have to state the facts of the situation. So, unfortunately for most of us, IT is very social. Communicating with people is very important. Your attitude at work can define relationships with others. When you come to work with a bad attitude and you go to help somebody, they're going to detect that bad attitude. And they're going to think they're the root cause of your attitude. Oh, I'm bothering him. I should leave him alone. So make sure you leave your baggage at home. Life is very tough. Body language also says a lot about you. How can I help you? Or, what can I do for you today? Make sure you're not presenting yourself in a negative way. Treat everybody the same. I said this earlier, and I'm saying it again. Even your executive members. The second you give preferential treatment, it's going to become an expectation, and in some cases, it will even be demanded. Prioritization should be your motivating factor. And lastly, educating users can lead to a lot less stress in the future. Make sure you invest that time. So I want to talk about workplace efficiency. And I'm not just talking about automation. I'm talking about what can you do with a process that you do every day to shorten that process and make it more efficient. Learn to spot these poorly created processes and take the initiative to fix them. As an example of this, our company was setting up machines one at a time from the factory with the factory image, and it cost us about an hour to build one machine. And that may not seem like much, but you need to make this more efficient. And I knew exactly what was needed. We needed an image. And nobody told me to fix it. And it wasn't being looked at as a problem, but I saw it as a big problem because we were losing a lot of time to this issue. So I created an image. I got all the software installed. I installed all the updates. We could have one machine ready in 30 minutes now. And this process was completely scalable and repeatable. And it left a lot less room for error. Less tickets equals less problems. But how can we improve upon this even further? We can get machines ready before they're needed. We can turn our delivery time of these machines to end users to 0. But what happens if it's not that perfect scenario that you can resolve right away? Sometimes poor processes can get shrugged off. And I hear it all the time, and I'll probably hear it again. It is what it is. Sometimes there is nothing you can do to make a process more efficient. Just keep that on the back burner. Write down your suggestions and ask for help from your colleagues. And lastly, just because your company is set in their ways, it doesn't mean you can't prove them wrong. I was working for a digital signage company that has a nationwide operation, and we had a major problem. Nobody cared to fix it. They just accepted that it was broken, that we could only get 12 PCs out per day. So I went around the office and I rummaged through and found an old firewall in the junk drawer. And this was perfect for me because the problem was we didn't have the right network set up. So after I set this up, and it took me maybe 15 minutes, we were able to produce 80 units a day, more than enough to keep our logistics center very happy. But what happens if you're working on a process like this and it doesn't work out? I say it's a commendable effort because you're trying to save the company exponential amounts of time by doing this. But inevitably, you will fail. Make sure you own up to your mistakes. Never lie. This is the fastest way to lose trust in your colleagues, your employer, your client, and you may even lose your job. All you have to do is state the facts of the situation. And remember that an excuse is not the same as an explanation. And be accountable for your actions. When you make these mistakes, make sure you make up for them as soon as possible. If you're stuck, get help. Don't dwell on your failures. A lot of us get stuck on a problem that we failed on, and we think about it all the time. But it's important to move on from it. Learn from it and move on, because there's going to be plenty more mistakes that you're going to make. And lastly, don't throw out blame to others. More than likely, when a failure happens, look at yourself first when you see a failure. Sometimes it totally is someone else's fault, but in most cases, you can reroute that back to yourself. Maybe you didn't anticipate the way a user was going to use their machine, or maybe you didn't give enough direction to help your colleague succeed. And lastly, I want to go to the topic of work presentation. Now, this is an actual example from a prospective client. Sloppy work presentation makes an easy sale for the next prospective MSP or service provider. When I was working for an MSP, I was tasked with being an auditor, and they would send me into these prospective clients' offices. And when I see something like this, I know I have an easy sale, because not only did they not spend the time to do a neat job, they probably missed a lot of things on the inside too. And 9 out of 10 times that was the case, and we would make the sale. This also casts doubt in your clients. Think about getting your oil changed in your car. You drop it off and you get it back. But what if it comes back dirtier than when you dropped it off? Do you feel like your oil change got done correctly? Or do you think there's probably going to be an issue later on? It's also incredibly inefficient to do this. Imagine having to move something here. It's going to take you more time, and you might be thinking, well, it's only a couple of seconds, but that adds up over time. Also, what you're not seeing in this picture is the floor, and unfortunately, I don't have a picture of that. There are power cables all over the floor. They're plugged into outlets and then they're just thrown on the ground. This is potentially dangerous. Watch out for it. And if you have an environment like this, I strongly encourage you, when you go back to work, go and fix it. Lastly, remember that a client's perception of you can make or break your job satisfaction. Who can tell me who cared more about this client's environment? Was it the cable guy or the managed service provider behind it? It was the cable guy. If you follow these guidelines, you're going to find yourself in a much better position at work and at home. Thank you for your time. Any questions?